Hi everyone, I'm the Rambling Photon, and today I want to talk about metrics. So, first things first, what is a metric? What do I think about metrics? And some other terminology that I will use as sort of interchangeable with metrics. So, in previous videos, I've talked about metrics in terms of how we evaluate logical conclusions and using them as a measuring stick, right, when we value something. So, metrics, you can think of them as a measure of merit. So, I will often switch between talking about metrics and merits fairly interchangeably. And I think the next important insight about metrics and merit is that metrics are inherently one-dimensional. So it is possible for a whole bunch of different variables to be summed up into a single metric. But the thing is that the metric itself is going to be one-dimensional, okay? So to understand why this is, we have to go into a little bit of basic math. So we should all be familiar with the number line, right? Going either, if you're working with the natural numbers, you're going 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. If you're talking about integers, you have positive and negative. So plus 1, 2, 3, 4, and minus 1, minus 2, minus 3, minus 4, etc. Now, we should also know about the real numbers, right? Which is just all of the fractional numbers, so all of the rationals, and then also all of the irrational numbers that exist on the number line, on the single number line, right? So those are all real numbers. That's pretty simple stuff, right? Now, the important part about metrics is that they are comparative. So what I mean by that is when you're talking about, especially in the sense of a merit function or something similar, so when you're talking about a function of merit, ultimately everything gets pared down to one dimension. And the reason for that is comparison. Whenever we make a value judgment or a value statement such as X is better than Y, or Y is better than Z, or Y is better than X, or whatever, or Y is worse than X, whatever you want, right? Anytime we're making a statement like that, what we're implicitly doing is we have an axis, which is the good-bad axis, and we have the values of X and Y existing somewhere on this axis. And when we say X is better than Y, or X is worse than Y, what we're doing is we're saying that X exists higher up on this dimension of goodness than Y does, right? And similarly, vice versa. What we're doing is we're saying the goodness value of X is greater than Y in mathematical terms, okay? So what this means is that we need to have that comparison. There is that comparative aspect to it. Now, why must it be a single dimension? Well, what happens when we go to multiple dimensions? When we go to the, say, real and imaginary plane? Okay, so we have the real axis and we have the imaginary axis. Okay, just think of it as, you can also think of it as x, y. Doesn't really matter. But imaginary is where it sort of comes up in single numbers in mathematics. Okay, how do we want to think of it now? So if we say real and imaginary is 2i, right, I being the square root of negative 1, is 2i greater or less than 1? Well, mathematically, it's not actually a particularly meaningful statement, right? Because it depends on which axis you're talking about, right? The real value of 2i is less than 1, right? It's 0. But the imaginary part of 2i is greater than 1 because it's 2 and not 0. Right? So because we have this multiple axis, in order to make a comparison, we need to somehow condense it into a single axis. We need to project onto a single axis. There are a number of different ways of doing it, and it depends on which metric you're using. So this is when we get into what a metric is. In some sense, is a projection of all of the important variables onto the axis of what you care about. Some mathematical ways of condensing the imaginary onto the real. So one thing you can do is you can either take just the real part, right? In which case 1 would be greater than 2i because the real part of 1 is greater than the real part of 2i. You can take the imaginary part, in which case the 2i would be greater than the real part. Or you can take the magnitude, which is another popular way of doing it, where you're taking the absolute value. You're taking the distance from 0 to whatever it is you're talking about, right? And so when you do that, you're condensing it onto a single axis. You're condensing it onto a single number. Okay? In the case of absolute value, you're taking the rotation of all space covered by this plane and putting it onto a single line, which represents the distance of each point from zero, right? And if we want to bring in some economics, one of the metrics, so I've talked about budget curves before. Going along with budget curves, there's a thing called indifference curves. And indifference curves are the amount of goods about which you feel equally, right? So you can think of it as all of the value states which have equal merit, okay? So that is, in the case of the absolute value metric, those would be just circles, radial circles centered at 0. In the case of real values, or the real portion of the number, it would just be lines at each real number. And conversely, for imaginary, it would be imaginary lines at each imaginary number. Okay, those would be the equal lines of equal merit. Okay, or lines of uniform metric. Okay, so why does this insight help us when we talk about other topics? Okay, why does this help us when we talk about social problems? Why does this help us when we talk about our values? Okay, well, so in engineering, particularly when you're talking about optimizations, anytime you're talking about an optimization of something, right? So if anybody talks about optimization of society, okay, you need to understand the merit function. You need to understand the metric that they are using to evaluate society, right? So the merit function is essentially taking all these variables, and it's how you choose to condense it down to this single axis, right? How do you condense it down to just a number? Okay, that's the merit function. So something that has merit can either be trying to maximize the merit function, or you can be trying to minimize the merit function, right? You're trying to do something with the merit function, okay? So if you're trying to maximize it, what you're going for are the components that go into it that increase the value of this merit function, right? And if you're trying to minimize it, you're trying to take away all the things that deviate from it, or that make you deviate from perfection, is usually the way it's defined. Is you defined perfect, and then deviations from perfect will increase your merit function. And so you're trying to minimize your merit function and get your merit function to 0, okay? With the acknowledgement that you will never actually truly be at 0, okay? So this is important when we're hashing out what our values are. One area where this is particularly important, and I think rather egregious, is one of the ways that we can define, say, affirmative action, or ways we can define racism or sexism, is that we have improperly defined our merit function for a person. Okay? So meritocracy is great, in my opinion. Okay? If you can pick the right merit function, if you can pick the right metric for merit, right? So there's sort of a situation where people are talking past each other with regards to this. So there's the people who think that because there are deviations from the demographics of wider society that exist within a particular group, right? So not enough women in tech, or not enough Black and Hispanic people in college, or some other disparity, demographic disparity. And they could be entirely correct. There is that disparity, okay? Now, why it exists, I'm not going to get into that in this particular video. But suppose that they claim that there is a discrimination against them, okay? What their objection is essentially is that the merit function that the society is using, the metric that society is using to evaluate Blacks and Hispanics, or women, or whatever discriminated group, is stacked against them. It is inaccurate, okay? And they could be right. It is entirely possible that they are correct in that. The problem is that they then attack the idea of meritocracy, of the idea of measuring people against some sort of standard, having some sort of metric by which people must perform in order to get the job, get acceptance into college, whatever, right? And I've seen this a little too often for my taste. So I think actually that the right response to this is to acknowledge that there could be an issue with the merit function. And so what needs to happen is if there is, we need to remove race and gender from the merit function and remove it so that it does not play a role. right? That would be the non-racist, non-sexist solution. The problem that I find with a lot of people advocating for affirmative action is that they, instead of advocating for trying to find the parts of the merit function and the metric that discriminate, and instead of saying, okay, we've identified these and we need to remove it, instead what they do is they add additional terms to the merit function and say, okay, if you are one of these groups, they explicitly bring race and sex into the merit function as a way of fixing that race and sex seemed to be appearing in the results of the evaluations of the merit function. And that's one of how they go against, and they speak out against meritocracy, because they think that meritocracy is somehow discriminating against people on the basis of their race and sex, but then advocate for including it in a different way in their solution, when the actual solution should be to figure out what parts of the metric and the merit function are biased and fix it, right? So it's possible that there's errors in the merit function, and I don't think anybody would disagree that having better measures of merit, having better metrics would be a problem. Anybody who's in favor of meritocracy should be in favor of having an accurate sense of who can get what done, right? Of who has merit. The entire point of meritocracy is that the people who do have that, whatever metric you're using, are able to succeed better than those who don't. And so having a way to measure that success is ideal. It would be ideal if you could have that, but we don't. We only have imperfect tools. So understanding the metrics and the merit function of what subject you're talking about, I think can be important, and it can clarify some of the issues that people bring up if you think about it that way. And in some ways, it's a question of matching what you measure with what you want to be measuring, right? So it could be that the SAT and the ACT and the IQ test are all perfectly good at measuring what it is they measure, right? And what it is they're being used to try to measure. But the moment that you change your application, you change your situation, you might not be interested in that measurement anymore. You might be interested in a different measurement or a different metric, okay? So this is also important to recognize, is that your merit function will change depending on which application, which group you're talking to, what society you're talking to. So in the context of a college, right, looking at people for college admission, right, what is our metric? Our metric is we want a good student who can study what we want them to study, get a degree, graduate, and then be successful in whatever their endeavors happen to be, so that they can give us more money as an alumni and serve as connections as value added to our next class of students, right? Okay. Well, that's one metric. How about entrepreneur? Okay. What are the metrics for an entrepreneur? What do you need to make an entrepreneur successful? Is the overlap between those characteristics and the characteristics of a good student the same? I would say no. I think an entrepreneur needs to be a little bit more independent. They need to be able to ask the right people for money and also be driven enough to keep working on things that people might say, oh, you shouldn't do that, right? A good student shouldn't rock the boat, really, right? But a good entrepreneur should, okay? Because they want to come in and disrupt a market, right? They want to come in, steal a whole bunch of customers from establishment people, and then make shit tons of money, right? Or they shift the landscape by creating something entirely new, right? But a student is not going to be doing that, right? A good student is going to not be making waves necessarily, or at least not making waves in a particular direction. And so in that sense, there might be a large correlation between aspects that would make both of these successful, right? Intelligence, if you want to be a good entrepreneur, it would help to be intelligent. If you want to be a good student, it would also help to be intelligent. But there are other characteristics that suit you to one versus the other, right? And so the metric for, say, a good college student will be different from the metric for a good entrepreneur, right? So in that sense, the metric that you're talking about changes depending on which subject you're talking about. So if we want to, say, go a little more abstract with it, what are the metrics for a successful society? This is sort of going back to one of my questions in one of my earliest videos. Well, that's one of the things I want to know. What is a good metric for a successful society? What is a good metric for a successful culture? What values does a successful culture or society have? And how is that different from the values that I personally hold to be good moral values? Is it possible that a morally good society will not satisfy the metrics of a successful society as well as a morally bad society? That's one of the more interesting questions that I'm going to try and find the answer to, do a little bit more research for you guys, and hopefully I will release a video about some of that at some point in the future. Anyway, I've rambled on long enough. So those are some of my thoughts on metrics and merit functions. If you like my content, like, share, subscribe, comment, all that shit. I've been the Rambling Photon. Hope to catch you next time.